This video is sponsored by Envato Elements. Envato provides over 1 million digital assets such as graphic elements, stock footage, fonts, music, and much more. So if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website, and of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 3 of Logo Animations. So let's take a look at what we're going to be creating. Before we get started, I do want to mention that this tutorial is a part of a series, and in case you haven't already watched the previous 2 episodes, then I definitely recommend that you check them out. Also, if you have any logo animation suggestions for next episode, then leave a comment down below. With all that said, let's jump right in and get started. Okay, so here we are now in After Effects, and I've already gone ahead and imported all of the materials that we're going to use. So let's create a new composition by going up to Composition, New Composition, or you could use Ctrl+N as a shortcut. And I highly advise everyone to always learn as many shortcuts as possible because it does speed up the workflow quite a bit. Now the first logo animation that we're going to be tackling is going to be the PlayStation logo. So let's just rename this comp to PS Tutorial. We'll leave it at 1080p. As for the frame rate, let's set it to 60. And you might have noticed that this tutorial is also recorded at 60 FPS, just so you can tell the difference. And the reason I'm choosing 60 FPS as opposed to like say 30 FPS is because we're going to be going for more fast-paced animations. So having that extra 30 FPS is going to help it seem a lot more smoother. And then we'll leave the duration at 10 seconds and just hit OK. Now we'll go over to the materials folder that I have here, and under PlayStation, we'll just click and drag the PlayStation logo and drop it onto the comp. And if you just click and drag anything like so, it'll just perfectly align it in the center. Now let's go over to Layer, New Solid, and we'll create a new background, which is white. Rename this background and hit OK. We'll bring it below the PlayStation logo, and now we have a fully white background. Now we'll use this PlayStation logo as a reference to recreate the shapes ourselves, so that later when we get to the animation part, we'll have full control over the animation. Now when it comes to the PlayStation logo design, it has this sort of 45-degree angle to it. So what we're gonna have to do is just recreate the shapes in a flat way, and then we'll use a camera to orient it so that it fits the perspective of the actual logo. So let's go ahead and get started with the S shape at the bottom here. And what we'll do is just make sure nothing is selected in the comp, and we'll grab the pen tool, and we'll just click and then hold down Shift, make another point here, and then hold down Shift so that it snaps horizontally or vertically. And then just keep making these points until you have this sort of S shape from a top-down view. Now let's go down to the contents of this shape, and we'll just delete the fill, so we're left with only the stroke. And then we can eyedrop maybe this color just so we can see it, and then we'll increase the stroke width. And now before we do any more adjustments, let's just turn this into a 3D layer, and we'll also select it and just hit return to rename it to S, and then click away. Now let's select it, hit Ctrl Alt Home, which will center the anchor point to the layer itself, and then we'll hit Ctrl Home, which will center the layer to the composition. Next up, let's click W to bring up the rotation tool, and then we can select the X-axis and just click and drag, and then hold down Shift to snap it to 45 degrees. Next up, we don't really want to rotate this until it actually fits with the angle of the S. Instead, we're going to use a camera to align it. So let's go over to Layer, New, Camera, and make sure it's a 2-node camera. Leave the settings at default and hit OK. Then we'll hit C to bring up the camera tool. And if you left click, you can orbit around the scene. Right click to dolly in and out, and then middle click to move around the scene. So let's Ctrl Z to undo, and we'll use these 3 shortcuts to just set up the perspective properly. So we'll just click and drag with the left mouse button to orbit around, and then we'll click on the middle mouse button. Let's just zoom in here. And what we're looking for is to use this edge here at the bottom as a reference so that we can align the perspective. So if we just zoom in here, click H by the way, and just pan around while using the hand tool. Or you could even just click middle mouse button while not being on the camera tool, because if you're in the camera tool, remember you move the camera itself. But you can go back to say V to the selection tool and then middle mouse click to pan around. And so let's go back to the camera once again, and let's just see if we can align this properly. So something like that. And I'm also looking to keep this line sort of in the middle of the S shape. Again, we can go back and make any adjustments later. Now, the reason I started with the S letter as opposed to with the P letter is because it is a more complex shape. So aligning the S shape first is going to be easier for us, because then we're going to be able to align the P letter much easier. Next up, you can see down here it says one view. Let's just switch that to 2 views horizontal, and we'll leave the left one to active camera. As for the right one, we'll set it to top view. And this is where we're going to be doing our adjustments. So in the top view, and then keep an eye out on the active camera as we update it. So let's select the S shape, hit G to bring up the pen tool. And now if we select these points, you can see they just automatically update in the active camera view. So what we're going to do is just start editing these points and just pushing them around until we get the shape that we want. We'll just bring these 2 points like so. What I'm looking for is just to keep this whole line in the center here, because again, we're going to go back and readjust the stroke width and also add an effector to it. So let's just bring these points up. I think that's fine for now. Let's go down to the S. Before we adjust the stroke width, let's add an effector called round corners. So you can see what that does. That immediately just rounds the corners. And then under the round corners tab here, we can increase that to get an even more curved shape. We could maybe select this S shape and the PlayStation logo, hit T to bring up the opacity and set them both to 50%, just so we can see where everything is at, and that'll make it easier to align stuff. So let's go back to the shape. We can maybe increase this a little bit. We'll select these ones at the bottom, push them down, and then this one, just push it up a bit until we get it to be behind the P letter. Also remember one thing, whatever adjustments you do to the points, make sure you do them in the top view, because if you make adjustments in the active camera view and say you're holding down shift and using the arrow keys, you can see even though I'm pushing up, it's not really going up in the top view, just because it's using the perspective that we're already in right now, which is in the active camera. So let's Control Z to undo everything. Okay, so I think the S shape is good enough for now, so let's move on to the P letter. Now, one way we could do this is say select the rectangle tool and then click and drag. And of course, we can't make any adjustments to these points. And that's because if we go down to the rectangle, you can see it is a rectangle path. And what we would need to do is to right click on it, convert to Bezier path, and then you just click G to bring up the pen tool and you can just move around the points. Now, one problem I found with doing it this way is because we're going to use guides in this case. So let's just bring up the rulers. So we'll go to View, Show Rulers, and then we'll make like a couple of rulers here. And we'll also make this into a 3D layer and go ahead and switch to the front view so that we can see the shape. You can see here, if we select one of these points and make sure Snap to Guides is checked, it sort of snaps in weird ways. So you can see it's not really snapping at these. Instead, it's snapping down here and up there and whatever. So I don't really know what the problem is with that, but I found that when I just create a shape with the pen tool, it just snaps right to it. So we'll just use this shape instead and then try to make some lines and have everything fit in within the P letter. So we'll just drag a line here. By the way, you can click and drag here to make vertical lines, or you can click at the top and this will allow you to make horizontal lines. So we'll do one here at the top. We'll grab this one and bring it down at the bottom. And now since we have crossing lines here, they can just easily snap to these points. But of course, you do need to make sure that the Snap to Guides is enabled. Now let's quickly turn this into a 3D layer. And you can see it automatically lines up with the perspective. And that's because we already set up the camera to match the S shape's perspective. And so in this case, the P letter is going to follow along and get right into place. But let's just make adjustments to the points here. So we'll hit G, select a point, hit V to bring up the selection tool. And we'll select both of those points. And then hold down shift and use the arrow keys just to move stuff around. You can see here, I'm using the front view to make adjustments and also using the active camera view just to see where everything is lining up. So we'll bring this guide here to wherever the points are right now, and we'll just snap to those. And then we'll select these other 2 points and just bring them over right about there. And let's just make sure the guides are in the same place as well. Now we'll select these ones at the top, move them up and bring the guide over there. You'll see why I'm doing this. I just want to keep everything straight up in line, as well as the one at the bottom. We'll just make sure it just goes up just a bit. Now we got the left side of the P letter filled in, but of course there's this extra shape here that we're gonna have to fill in. So what we're gonna do is just add a few points and then just adjust them and move them around until it lines up perfectly. But before we do any of that, let's just go down to the contents, and I want to get rid of this stroke effect and also hit T to bring up the opacity and bring it down to 50%. Hit G, bring up the pen tool, add a point to about there, and you can see it's almost lining up. So let's just bring it down a bit. I'm keeping an eye on both views at the same time. Now we'll bring another line here. Make sure this point snaps to it, and then we'll add another point here, bring it over to this point, and then we'll add a guide there. Make sure this snaps, and then add another point. And this one, we're gonna make sure it's sitting right at the middle of this base here. So around there, we'll add another line there vertically. And then finally, we'll add another point right here and just snap it to this line and just go down until we hit this corner. And we'll bring another line right there. Now, of course, it has spiky corners, so we're gonna have to switch them to curved points instead. So we'll do that by going up to the pen tool, click and hold down on it, and then go down to this convert vertex tool. And then you can just click on these points and those will be turned into curved points. Now, if we click on either one of these handles, it'll adjust both of the curves, so on both sides. But instead, what we want to do is let's just switch to the pen tool by clicking G. And now we can hold down Control and you can see the icon switches, and then we can just click on one of them and control them individually. So we'll do one like that, and we'll do one like this. For this one, actually, we'll control both of them at the same time, so no need to split them. This one at the top, just make sure you straighten that out. And then over here at the top, you could also bring a guide in so that these curves go up the same amount on both sides, so everything is perfectly symmetrical. Now, I did forget to do one thing, and which is very important actually. So let's go back to the active camera view. Let's shut off the original logo. We'll bring these two back to 100% opacity, and you can see how they're sort of intersecting with each other, and that's because of the way they are positioned in 3D space. So if we switch to say a custom view 1, so we can move around the scene in a non-destructive way, basically the P is positioned like at the center of the S letter, and what we want is to actually position it sort of right here instead. And the way we're going to do that is let's go over to the top view on the right here and select the S shape. We'll hit Y to bring up the anchor point tool. Then we'll just click and drag on the anchor point, and we'll hold down Control to snap it to that corner right there. Or we could just simply turn on the snapping right here at the top, and now it'll automatically snap into that point. Then we'll grab the P letter. Let's just rename that real quick to P. Go back to the front view, and we'll set the anchor point for this at the bottom. And now once we copy the position of the S and paste it to the P letter, it's gonna jump to that exact same spot. Now we can go back to the active camera view, and then we'll bring back the original logo, bring these back to 50% opacity. And now we can go ahead and make adjustments so that everything lines up perfectly again. Now, first of all, if we go in here and just zoom in, you can see we have to push it a bit to the left like so. And then we can maybe just grab all of the points here at the top and just move them down. And then we'll move this one to the left. And there you go. We can now bring these back up to 100%. Now let's switch back to one view and then go back to the active camera. And we could also go over to view and just clear the guides, and then Control R to hide the rulers. Now if we click C to bring up the camera, just orbit around, you can see we have ourselves a 3D PlayStation logo. We can turn off the original one, and we're all good to go. Now if we duplicate the original logo and just move this one over and bring the opacity back, you can see the original one, the S shape has these sort of parts, so it's split into different kinds of parts with different kinds of colors. Now a really easy way to recreate that would be to use the trim paths effector. So if we go to the S shape and under contents, we can add a trim paths effect. And if we go down here and adjust the end value, for example, you can see how it trims away at the path. So what we're gonna do is, first of all, let's make sure that the trim paths and the round corners are inside of the shape. Then we'll bring back the original logo in its original position, decrease the opacity for this one, and we'll shut off the P letter. And we'll use the original one as a reference to trim the paths. So get this first one to line up there. Then we can rename this to yellow right, and then duplicate it. So Control D or Edit, Duplicate. Then we can go down to this one, and then under trim paths again, we can just make adjustments to the end or the start value. Now they can overlap a bit, but that's fine. And we'll rename this to cyan right and keep going. Okay, so you can see here I duplicated all of these shapes and then adjusted the trim paths on each one of them to get the desired effect. So now what we can do is just select the shape and maybe search in here color and then start pick whipping the color from the original logo. So let's see here, we go down the yellow right, we'll pick the color from that. The cyan right will do that. The blue one will do that, and so on and so forth. Okay, now if we clear the search, shut off the original logos and bring the opacity back to 100%, you can already see what's going on. Now, of course, we also need to get the color for the P. So in order to do that, we could either go down to the color for this and pick that, or we could have added, say, a fill effect or a tint effect or whatever works best for you. I like to keep things as clean as possible, so in the future, if you want to make any adjustments, we can easily do that without having to hassle around the scene. Okay, we're pretty much set up with the shape, and now we can start animating. Now the first thing I want to do is select the camera, hit AA to bring up the camera options, and I want to make sure the zoom is set to like 10,000. And the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted to have sort of an orthographic view, so remove complete sense of depth. And this way, even though we're close to the logo, we don't have any sort of like wide angle view to it. And now we can just right click, hold down shift by the way to dolly out much faster. And we'll go back to the original state. First off, let's focus on the P letter animation. And what I did in the original one was to just reveal it from the bottom up. Now you could think we could simply get away with, say, a linear wipe effect. So let's just control space. And by the way, this brings up the FX console plugin, which is a third-party plugin from videocopilot.net. And it allows you to simply click control space to bring up a search bar here and then type in whatever effect you're looking for. So linear wipe, you just search that, hit enter, and it adds it to your effects controls. Instead of using the default effects and presets bar here, so you could just select, type in linear wipe or whatever and just click and drag, it just saves you a few extra steps. And on top of all that, it's completely free, so I definitely recommend that you check it out. Anyway, back to the linear wipe effect. Let's get the angle to face 180 degrees, and then we can just increase this and maybe zoom in here, see if we can adjust the wipe angle to get the perspective right, so something like that. And you know, if you didn't have a moving camera, you could simply get away with this. But since we're going to be animating the camera, what happens is, because this is a 2D effect, when we orbit around the scene, the wipe angle doesn't really follow. So let's just delete the linear wipe effect. And what we'll do is go over to Layer, New, Solid, and we'll type in P Matte. Color doesn't matter, and we'll hit OK. Then we'll switch this to a 3D layer. Let's zoom out here, hit Y to bring up the anchor point, snap it at the bottom of the layer, select the P letter, hit P to bring up the position, Control C to copy the position, and Control V to paste the position to the matte. And so now the solid that we just created is in the exact same spot as the P shape itself. Now all we have to do is just scale it down just so that it roughly covers the entire P letter. And we'll leave it just above the top there. And we'll bring it right above the P letter, and we'll hit F4 to toggle the switches, or you can click down here, or you could even just enable them to stay on all at the same time. And you also have this one for durations and stretching and all that. But I do like to keep this one off, and we'll set this one to alpha matte, the layer above. And so now check this out. If we just scale this down, it uses it as a matte. And also say we orbit around, since this is a 3D layer as well, the angle is gonna match properly. Control Z, go back to normal, and we'll set the scale to be right there at the top. And what we'll do is just hit S, bring up the scale, hit the stopwatch, and then we'll go over to, say, 30 frames, which is half a second. Remember, we're doing 60 frames per second, and we'll set a keyframe there at the end. So this is the end position. We'll go back to the beginning, and we'll just drag it down all the way at the bottom. Or we could just unlink these and just set the Y scale to 0. And now if we hit N here to bring up the work area end and hit 0 to RAM preview, you can see it reveals from the bottom up. Of course, we could hit U to bring up the keyframes on the P matte and just select those and just hit F9 to smooth them out. Actually, for the first one, I just want to leave it linear. By the way, I'm control clicking on them to put them back to linear keyframes, or you could just hit F9 to make them into eased keyframes. And you could right click, go to keyframe velocity, and then I like to do 75%, and we'll preview that. So you can see it starts off fast and then slowly comes to a stop. And we're pretty much done with the animation of the P letter. Now, as for the S letter, what we're going to do is select it, go over to the search bar and type in offset. And we're actually going to animate the offset value for each of these paths. So you can see what that does. If we just increase this one, you see it just offsets the path around the mask that we have created. Now, if we turn on the stopwatch for all of these paths and just move forward in time and then set a keyframe there, then we can go back and then just make sure you drag them on the negative side. What's going to happen is they're going to come in from this side and then end up to the spot that they're supposed to be originally. Now, I don't want to overdo this, so let's see. Let's just drag it. Make sure that that last piece is just starting to come out, so like that. Now, of course, we need to select this offset value, and we can go over to Edit, Copy, and then we can select all of these offset values by holding down Control and then Control V to paste. And now you can see everything is just moving in the same direction. Let's just select all of these and then we'll hit F9, right click, keyframe velocity, 75%. Now let's also adjust the timing of these. So we'll bring them back all the way at the beginning here. And let's see, where was the PMAT? So yep, exactly at the same time. Actually, we need to push them forward a bit. And I think those are a bit too fast. So we'll click and drag and just move them back to 1 second. And also these ones, will just move them back to like, I don't know, 130. Now, finally, what we need to make sure we do is to also reveal this S shape behind as well. So we don't want to see it at the beginning. We just want to reveal it the same way as we do with the P letter. Now, you might be thinking we could just go down here to the contents and say add an effector, which is the trim paths, and just start to increase or decrease that. But you see, the problem with this is that the way it renders stuff. So even if we switch the mode to individually, it's gonna start to pop everything in one by one. So we're still not gonna be able to get the exact result that we want. So let's just delete that and then we'll duplicate this. So this is gonna be our S matte, and we'll go down to the contents and we'll delete everything apart from one of them. And we'll go down to the trim paths and just uncheck the offset and right click and reset. We'll also bring the end value all the way to 100%. And then finally, we'll set this one to alpha matte. And this way, we'll use the trim paths of this one at the top as a matte, and we'll reveal the entire thing. So let's just set a keyframe here at the start, bring this back to 0, and we'll go over to 2 seconds, and we'll bring this back to 100%, F9, and 75%. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Now finally, we can focus on the camera animation. So let's select the camera, hit P to bring up the position, set a keyframe there at 3 seconds. Then we'll move back a bit and then hit C to bring up the camera tool and just start making adjustments to it. And let's see, oops, that's too much. So we'll bring it very close to the camera and then we'll maybe orbit around like so. And we'll just bring this over here at the start. And now we have this animation. Again, we'll select this one, we'll F9 to easy ease. And we'll bring this one all the way to 100% actually. So let's just preview that. And I'm thinking maybe the PMAT could finish its animation in the same amount of time as the SMAT does. So let's see, let's hit U on this and hit U on this. Actually, let's just bring them both to 130. And let's see, I'm gonna zoom in here, make sure this just stays slightly on top. And then I think one last thing that I did was to hit AA to bring up the camera options, and we'll set a keyframe for the zoom, and we'll bring this one at the start here. We'll set it to like 12,000, and we'll go over to 4 seconds, and we'll set it to 9,500. And we'll also easy ease that. And this way, even though the camera comes to its final position, we still have some sort of extra zoom out all the way at the end. And we'll select this one, keyframe velocity, and we'll do like 60%. All right, let's give that one last preview. Okay, so that was pretty much it for the PlayStation logo animation. We can now move on to the IKEA logo animation. Moving on with the IKEA logo, let's go over to Composition, New Composition, and we'll rename this to IKEA Tutorial. We'll leave the settings the same as before, but this time, before we hit OK, let's go over to 3D Renderer and make sure we switch to the Cinema 4D render. And you'll see why in a minute. Let's now hit OK. We'll drop down the materials folder, and under IKEA, let's drag and drop the IKEA logo into our comp. We can hit S for scale and just scale it down. And then let's quickly create a new solid. and we'll get the color from this, hit OK, and we'll rename it background and just bring it at the bottom. Before we go ahead and recreate the IKEA logo, let's just shut it off for a second, just so we can focus on the features that are available with the Cinema 4D renderer. So let's go up to the text tool, click and drag, and we'll just type in IKEA in this case, and then we'll select it, Control Home, hit S, bring up the scale and just scale it up. Then just set the color to white and hit OK. And now we'll switch it to a 3D layer. And once we go down to the contents of the text, you can see down here it says geometry options and material options. And these are available only with the Cinema 4D renderer. So if we go down to the geometry options, you can see we have 3 values here, or actually 4 that we can control. Now the first one is the bevel depth, and if we increase that, nothing really is going to happen just because the bevel style is set to none. But before we play around with that, let's take a look at the extrusion depth. Right away when we increase that, you can see what's going on. Basically, it's being extruded in 3D space. We can see that a bit better if we create a new camera. So let's do that and then hit C and just orbit around. Now do keep in mind that this tends to slow down your computer, even though right now we only have a simple 3D text. If we orbit around in full quality, it's still lagging a little bit. But if we just scroll the wheel on our mouse and just go down to quarter, we can just orbit around a bit quicker. Anyway, we'll go down to the bevel depth now, and we'll just increase that and switch the bevel style to angular, for example. And you can see what that does. It basically creates a bevel right at the edges here. So let's go back to half resolution, and then you can play around with different kinds of bevels. So if we switch to concave or convex, and right now we don't really have much definition because the lighting is completely flat. Or actually we don't have any lighting for that matter. So let's go over to layer, new light, and we'll create an ambient light. We'll set it to 50%, hit OK, and then we'll duplicate this and we'll go over to layer, light settings, and we'll set this to a point light and we'll set it to 100% intensity, and we'll also leave cast shadows on and hit OK. Now we got just a bit more definition to our scene, so we can move around the light. Then we can go back to the IKEA and just start playing around with the different kinds of bevels. Now there's also this whole bevel depth, which basically affects any sort of letter that might have holes in it. So it would be the A letter, for example. I think also the O letter. So let's just double click on that and see if you increase this to 100%, there will be bevels created inside holes as well. But if you leave it to 0, there won't be any bevels inside of holes. But let's Control Z and let's get rid of the O letter and also set the bevel style back to none. Then we can go down to the material options, and you can see there's a bunch of material options down here. First of all, we got the cast shadows, and if we turn that to on, since the light that we're using, the point light, has cast shadows on, and you can see down here it says cast shadows on, and also shadow darkness. So let's just increase that just so we can see it a bit better, and also bring down the diffusion to 0. And we can take it one step further. We could maybe go over to layer, new solid, and we'll make this white and rename this to ground. We'll turn this into a 3D layer, hit W to bring up the rotation tool and just rotate it 90 degrees. This can act as our ground essentially. So we can scale it up, and there you go. You can see that shadows are being created on our ground. Now in this case, say we want the ground to be completely white. Well, what we could do is just AA on that to bring up the material options and just set the accept lights to off. And so what'll happen is it'll be completely white because it won't be affected by any lights on our scene, but it will accept shadows. Now there's another cool option that comes with the Cinema 4D renderer, and that is the reflection intensity. So if we increase that to 100% for the ground layer, you can see it actually reflects our text. Now let's switch to full view real quick and hit C to bring up the camera and just move in here. You can definitely see how slow that is though. When it comes to reflections, you can definitely notice that there's some aliasing going on. So that's something that you should keep in mind when it comes to using reflections with the Cinema 4D render. Anyway, let's bring the reflection intensity back to 0%. And let's go back to the point light and maybe increase the shadow diffusion just to make things look a bit prettier. And we'll also maybe just bring down the shadow darkness to 75%. We could maybe say select the ground and go over to layer, solid settings, and just pick the color from our actual background just so we can see things a bit better, and maybe even just tone down the shadow intensity. Now there's one last thing I want to cover before we move on to the actual logo animation. So we did create the text layer and we saw what kind of features are available under the geometry options. And if we go back to the shape layer, make sure nothing is selected, and let's just create a shape layer here. And we turn this into a 3D layer and go down to the geometry options. You can see we have pretty much the same values, the same options. Whereas if we select the solid ground and go down under the geometry options, you can see the values are a bit different. And in this case, just to see a bit better, let's go back to the solid settings and make this completely red. We can increase this curvature value, and basically it just bends the entire solid so you have this curved plane. And we can maybe even just increase the segments, and we'll hide the shape layer just so we can see it a bit better. So that's the difference between shape layers and text layers compared to solids whenever you're using the Cinema 4D renderer. Okay, so with pretty much all of the features covered, we'll now select all of these layers that we created and just hit delete, and we'll bring back the original logo and now start recreating this. Now, same as before, we'll go over to view, show rulers, and start making guides so that we can use them and recreate the shape ourselves. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll bring a line down here and we'll bring a line up here first and foremost. And now we'll start bringing in lines horizontally as well as vertically to have everything in place. Now I'm going to speed past this process just because it does take a bit of time, but you pretty much get the idea. Okay, so I finished up adding a bunch of these lines and they'll make complete sense once we start adding the points. So let's click G to bring up the pen tool. Make sure you don't have anything selected at the bottom and then start adding points. Of course, do make sure Snap to Guides is turned on, and then we can just click and then click and hold and just snap it to all of these corners. And now as we move along, you'll see why I created certain lines and certain intersections. So wherever I want to snap a certain point, that's where I created a vertical line and also a horizontal line. So let's just keep adding these points and we'll close that one out. We could even just shut this one off just so we can see things a bit better. But do make sure that you have this selected whenever you're adding new shapes so that the shapes get created inside of this layer. By the way, you can see there's some sort of curved lines here on each of these letters' edges. Well, we're just gonna skip past those just for the sake of simplicity. Okay, so now that I'm finished recreating the letters, let's Ctrl R to hide the rulers. And just so you know, you can actually export guides. So before you clear them, say you want to save them for a later use, for example, we can go over to View, Export Guides, and we'll just type in IKEA Guides, and we'll hit Save. Now if we clear the guides, we can go back to View, Import Guides, and then just double click on the guides that we saved, and there we have it. Anyway, that was just a quick tip that I wanted to mention, but let's just clear the guides, and now let's select the shape layer. And first things first, let's just search for stroke, and we'll select all the stroke effectors and we'll delete them because we don't want any strokes on our text. And now we'll clear the search and turn the shape back on, and let's just rename it to IKEA. Now let's go down to the contents, and I think it should be the last shape. Yep, that one. We can just go into the shape 5 and also shape 4. We'll select this path on the shape 5, which is the inner part of the A letter, and we'll just bring that into the shape 4 and also move it on top of the fill. And then on the right side here, you got these two icons. Well, we can click on the one on the right to reverse the path, and this basically makes a hole inside of the A letter. Now let's just delete the shape 5 since there's nothing in there. Next up, we could turn this into a 3D layer. And the first thing that you might notice is that this hole is filled in again. And that's because for some reason, After Effects doesn't take into account the reverse path option whenever the layer is a 3D layer. So what we're gonna do is select the shape and add a merge paths effector, and then go down here and just set it to merge. And there you go. Then we can drop those down and go over to geometry options. And just like I showed you before, we can increase the extrusion depth. So let's see here, we can maybe bring this up to, I don't know, 150. We do need to have a camera so we can see things a bit better. So let's go over to layer, new camera, hit OK. and then we can left click and orbit around. Now I do want to select the IKEA layer and just search for color, and we'll delete all of the fill effectors and then go into the contents and add a fill effect and leave that outside all of the shapes so we have one single fill effect to worry about. And we'll set this one to be the same color as the blue of the IKEA. Also, just to make things a bit easier to see, we'll duplicate the background and then we can go over to layer, solid settings, and we'll set the color to this yellow background, and we'll shut off the original logo for now. Now the camera is oriented in a weird way, so let's hit P to bring up the position, and we can right click and reset on that. And let's just do a few more things before we get to the animation part, and that is to create a new light. So let's go over to layer, new light, and we'll set it to an ambient light with 50% intensity, hit OK, and then we'll duplicate this and go over to light settings, and we'll set it to parallel light with 50% intensity as well. Cast shadows on, sure, and then hit OK. Now, if we go down and turn off the yellow background, we want to make sure that the front side of the text is the same color as the original background color, just so that we stay consistent within the design concept. Anyway, we'll bring back the yellow background, and now we can hit C to bring up the camera tool and maybe start to get the orientation that we're going to be using. So let's see, maybe something like that. Do keep in mind that parallel lights don't really make any difference if you just move them around. The only way you can change the look of the scene with a parallel light is if you adjust the point of interest. So let's see, we can maybe drag it down a bit. We'll go down to the ambient light. We can maybe increase the intensity. We'll bring back the background so you can see if we have the same color. So something like that. Again, we're looking to create as much definition as possible so you can tell the difference between this shape on this side and then this shape of the K on the top side. So basically each side has a different value of luminance. Now we're pretty much ready to animate, but before we do that, let's go down to the camera options, and I'm gonna make sure we go to 10,000 zoom for this one as well, just because I want this sort of isometric look for the IKEA logo animation as well. Now we can hold down the right click button, hold down shift to really dolly in and out very fast. Let's see, maybe even zoom it in a bit, just so the letters are a bit bigger. Now before we do anything, let's just talk a bit about the concept of the animation. So in the original logo animation, what I did was to morph each of these letters into each other, and then all the way at the end I had them appear one by one, so we're left with the IKEA logo, and then finally the yellow circle comes in and we end up with the original logo design. And the way we're going to achieve that is by animating the path value for all of these letters. Before we do that, let's just duplicate this IKEA layer 4 times, so 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll hide the bottom one, so we'll leave that as a backup for the original, and now we'll just go down to the contents for each of these, and we'll start deleting shapes and only leaving one letter for each layer. So for the first one, we'll delete the first 3 shapes, and we'll rename this to I. Then for the second one, we'll delete the third and fourth and also the first one, so we only have the K letter, and so on and so forth. Now what we can do is select all of them, hit Ctrl-Alt-Home to center the anchor point to each of those letters, and then Ctrl-Home to center them all at the center of the composition. And now they're pretty much in the same spot. Next up, let's switch to 2 views horizontal, and we'll go over to the front view on the right side. And you can see they've been actually pushed all the way over there. So what we can do, just so we can see them a bit better in the front side, is just to select all of these layers, including the camera, and just push them until the layers are pretty much in the middle of the scene, just so we can animate them easier. And you can see in the active camera, nothing really changed because we did move all of the layers together with the camera. Next up, we can hide all of the letters except the I letter and start animating. Now, as for the I letter, we can animate this in 2 ways. Either we can animate the path value, or we could say put the anchor point at the bottom here and just animate the scale. So that's what we're gonna do, just to be perfectly precise. Let's hit S to bring up the scale, set a keyframe there, and we'll move over to 10 frames, set a keyframe there, go back, and we'll unlink the scale values and set the Y scale to 0. Now we'll go over to the last frame, and this is where we'll bring in the K letter. By the way, let's select all of these and just set the opacity to 50% on all of them, just so it makes it a bit easier to see where everything is lining up. And now for the K letter, what we're going to do is just Push it in the x-axis until the left side of the K letter matches with the I letter. Now for this one, we can search path and set a keyframe there. Push this over, so this is where it's gonna end up. And then over here on the 10th frame, we want to make sure the shape is the same as the I shape so that it looks as if it is morphing in from the I letter to the K letter. So first off, let's just select these 2 points on the left and we can push them over to the left side just so we line up with the I letter a bit better. Then we can select these 2 points and maybe line them up vertically with the middle point, like so. You don't have to be perfect with this. And then we can select all of these points and just push them over to the left. Remember, I'm holding down Shift to snap them horizontally. And what we want to do is just to make sure everything just comes in right there, just roughly. Next up, we can click on this layer and then trim it to 1 frame after the first frame of the animation. And now if we zoom in here on the active camera view, we can also trim the I letter here by holding down Alt and close square bracket. So now if we use the page up and page down keys to move forward and backwards by 1 frame, just focus on the active camera view, and we could even just turn the opacity back to 100%. We'll bring the work area end and hit 0. Again, this is a bit too fast, but you get the idea. Now we can maybe move this over to say frame 20 and then easy ease that. And maybe even easy ease this. Now I'm probably not going to be able to get the same result as in the original logo animation just because of the way I set up the timing, and I did play around with that a lot more than we're going to be doing in this tutorial because again, we do want to keep it as short as possible while at the same time covering as many techniques as possible. Anyway, now we can maybe linger for up to 5 seconds, so we'll go over to frame 25, set a keyframe there. And this is where the E letter comes in. Now what we can do is go over by 10 frames, so frame 35, and we can copy this one, so the initial state, and then Control V to paste, so it goes back to the same shape that it had before. Now we can bring the E letter back on, and we'll just reposition it again, just so that it sits within the K letter. Ignore all of these weird shapes that are being created right here. We'll go 1 frame before and trim it there. And then 1 frame after, we'll turn the E letter back on. And this way we can just animate the path for this. We'll go over to frame 45, hit a keyframe. Then we'll go back a few frames. And I think what I did in the original animation is to just have these lines come in 1 by 1, sort of like drawers, for example. So let's select both of those points and just bring them over to the left side. You can zoom in here and just make sure everything is in line. And then we'll move back a few more frames and we'll just set these to be right in line. Let's see, we'll do like 5 frames each. So 45, this comes here, and then 50, this comes here. And we can easy ease all of those and maybe give 10 frames to the last one and even 75% that. So we'll right click keyframe velocity and just 75% and hit OK. Let's just keep moving for now and get done with the A letter. So we'll go over to 1 second after we've left this to linger for like 5 frames. We'll set a keyframe there and then move over to 1 and 10 and we'll copy the first keyframe, paste it over. And now for the A letter, what we need to do is just to morph it on the left side instead. So we'll turn on the A letter, trim it here, Alt, open square bracket. With it selected, we got the path searched up at the top here. We can just hit enter and this will reveal the paths. What we'll do is set keyframes for both of those. And we'll also make sure to move it all the way over to the left side. We'll make sure that we have the corner here, the point here, lined up with the shape of the E letter. Then we'll move these 2 path keyframes over and now we'll start making adjustments in a way that will make sense. So what we need to do is make sure that this lines up with this shape or like with this line, and then this lines up with that line. Trust me, it'll all make sense once we see it in action. Then this one has to line up with this and this one has to line up with this. We'll do the same thing with this one and we'll make sure that this goes all the way at the same spot at that point, and we'll just drag those in and we'll make sure to keep them in line with these lines at the bottom. Finally, we'll drag all of these points, we'll move them over, and then we'll drag all of those points and we'll move them over until they hit the edge here of the E letter. So right about there. We can push them 1 frame earlier and we'll select both of these and just F9 and 75%. And also make sure we trim this right here. So there you go, that looks pretty cool. But anyway, now for the last part, we need to make sure all the other 3 letters come in. And to do that, we're gonna duplicate the original backup that we had, and we're gonna turn it back on. First things first, let's just Control-Alt-Home to center the anchor point, and then copy the position from this letter to this, so that they sit in the same spot. And then what we'll do is just bring the position of this until it sits in the same spot, basically. And then we'll go down to the contents and delete shape 4, so we don't have 2 A's. And what we'll do now is parent these to the A letter, and we'll rename this to I key without the A. Now we'll hit U to see where the keyframe was, so we'll go there, and then we'll give it like 5 frames to linger, and then hold down Shift, hit P to bring up the position while keeping the paths. Set a keyframe there, we'll move over by 145, and then we'll just bring this over to the right side, and of course, seeing as these are parented, they will move with it. Now let's select these, Easy Ease and 75% on this one. By the way, you might have seen this Flow plugin that I have docked in here. It is a third-party plugin, but it does save me a ton of time whenever I'm easing stuff. So like, instead of having to select them and then going to keyframe velocity and hit F9 and this and that, all I have to do is just select keyframes, and I have presets saved in here. And say we have linear keyframes, just select them, double click, and now we have 75% by 75% on each. But as I said, this is a third-party plugin, but I hope you don't mind us saving some time. From now on, I'm gonna use these presets up here. Anyway, let's see what that does. We'll switch to quarter view just so we can preview this a bit faster. So let's see. That's a bit too quick. We can maybe push this over like so. Of course, we do need to orient the camera as well to have it come back to a frontal view. And at the same time, we're gonna have the letters here come in and animate as well. So let's focus on the letters first of all. We can go down to the contents under the shapes for each of these, and we'll drop down the paths. Of course, we could have searched for the path as well. But anyway, we'll set a keyframe for all of these. We'll push these over. And now instead of having to go in and adjust these again, what we'll do is go over to the individual letters here and just copy the path keyframe right here where the E letter is completely off. We'll copy that and we'll go back here and see which one is the E shape. So I think this is the one. So yeah, we'll just paste the shape right there. And now we have a flat out shape. But of course, we don't need to put it on that keyframe. We have to go back, set a keyframe here, and we'll just paste it there. And so now we have that same animation so that we don't have to bother recreating the shape again. We'll do the same with the other two. Now let's bring this down and let me just show you something real quick. So what we're gonna do is have both of these shapes go inside of the I letter, like so. And then finally, we'll hit S to bring up the scale. Make sure that the anchor point is right here at the bottom somewhere so that when we animate the Y-axis, it comes in from the bottom. And what we'll do is just set a keyframe there, move this forward, and bring this one down to 0. Now, if we hit U to bring up all of the keyframes, let's just adjust the timing like so. Now we did not adjust the path of the I letter, so we'll just delete that keyframe and we'll easy ease those and we'll 75% this. Remember, all I have to do is just select the keyframes and double click on that. Now if we go back and maybe push these back as well, have the start to come in at the same time and also end up at the same time. Now if we preview this and just look at the active camera, what's happening is they're all scaling up and at the same time the K and the E letter are coming out of the I letter. Now we could say, for example, have the scale start coming in a bit earlier and the path come in even earlier, and then this one just comes in later. We can just move the timing. Ooh, I think that's the wrong order. We'll do this so that we have the E letter come in a bit earlier. And then finally, they all stretch into place. Now, before we start animating the camera, let's go over to the top view and make sure that the point of interest is sitting exactly at the same spot as the IKEA logo. Let's go to two views. We'll see in the top view on the right side. And let's just make sure that the view doesn't change too much on our logo animation. So something like that. So that now in the active camera view, when we orbit around, it orbits around the IKEA logo. Now we can hit P to bring up the position, set a keyframe there, move it back in time, and then right click on the position and hit reset. Of course, we might see that it's not really aligned too well, but we could maybe push it like so until this line is perfectly in the center. We could also just turn on the original logo and try to align it to that. It needs to be a bit bigger, so we'll dolly in and then we'll move over like that as well. It actually needs to be a lot bigger, so let's do that. We'll see how it looks. So we'll turn off the title action save, turn off the original logo, and then easy ease those. Again, this is way too fast. We could maybe drag this one over and set that to 75%, so that it takes a bit longer to orient, but we could push it a bit to the left. Now, another extra layer of animation that I added to these letters at the beginning is to animate the position as well. So if we hit U to bring up the keyframes and then hold down Shift, hit P, we can set a keyframe for the position, bring this all the way over to the beginning, and then go over to the last frame. What we can do is actually push it to the right side as well. And then F9 these just so they have the same easing. And so what happens is not only do they morph from the I letter, but they also move over to the right side, and then set a keyframe here and then go back to the end and then set the same keyframe so it goes back to the initial state. And then we can do the same thing pretty much for the E letter. So we'll hit U to bring up the keyframes. And for the E letter, we can actually go over to the last frame, so where all of these lines come in. And we'll set a keyframe there and we'll just move it over like so. Hit F9 and we'll 75% that. And then we'll go to the last frame, make sure we have the initial state. And we can do the same thing for the A letter as well, but we're gonna skip through that. And then all the way at the end here, we can see where the camera starts to orbit around. So it goes into a frontal view. So we'll select the camera, hit U, and then we'll go to this keyframe. And what we'll do is select these two layers and search up here for extrusion depth. So extrusion depth. And we'll set a keyframe for both of those. And we'll go over to the last frame and we'll set the extrusion depth to 0, F9 those, and 75% these two first keyframes. This way, as they are rotating, the extrusion is also shrinking down. So when we go to full frontal view, we have a complete 2D logo, as opposed to having extrusion, which might end up, just having some sort of edges here visible. And we do not really want that. So yeah, let's Control Z actually, and we'll have these both at 0 extrusion depth. And the final thing is to add the circle animation, so we can turn the original logo back on to use as reference. We'll select our yellow background, double click on the ellipse tool, which will create a perfect ellipse. Then we can double click on the mask and then hold down Control and Shift to scale it down proportionally, and we'll just make adjustments. So that seems fine. And then we can hit M to bring up the mask path, set a keyframe there, move this over, and then just double click on the mask and have it just scale up like so. And we can line it up with the timing of the camera as well. Okay, so there you go. We're pretty much done with the IKEA logo animation as well. Of course, I am aware that this clearly doesn't look as good as the original version that I did. And that's to be expected, since I'm not trying to perfectly recreate the animation from start to finish, but I am trying to cover pretty much all of the techniques that I used to create this animation. With all that said, we can now move on to the last logo animation for this tutorial, and that is the Apple logo animation. Alright, moving on to the next and last logo for this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the Apple logo animation. Let's go over to composition and we'll create a new composition for the last time. And we'll just rename this to Apple Tutorial. Now keep in mind that After Effects remembers the settings that you last used. So we're gonna have to go to the 3D renderer and make sure we switch back to the classic 3D. And we'll leave the settings all the same and hit OK. Then we'll go under Materials, Apple, and we'll grab the Apple logo and just drop it into our comp. And right away we could use this PNG image since it is transparent. But what I want to do is actually recreate this with a shape layer. So let's go over to the rectangle tool and we'll click Q to switch until we get to the ellipse tool. Make sure we don't have anything selected. And then let's turn on the title action save. And we'll make sure to click right here in the middle and hold down Control, Alt, and Shift. Then we'll hit T, bring down the opacity just so we can see behind it. And then we'll go under the contents and we'll delete the stroke. Also, we'll right click on the ellipse path and convert to Bezier path. We'll hit G, double click on the mask, and we'll just bring this one down. We'll just put it like so, and then we'll start making adjustments as we go. So maybe just scale it down like that. Of course, we do need to add extra points so we can align it to the shape properly. So what we'll do is select the shape, hit G, and then we'll just start adding some points here. So we'll do one here, and then we'll do one here on the other side, and then we'll just start adjusting these. So we'll bring this one up, and then we'll select both of these and just bring them down. Then we'll bring this point here at the top a bit lower like so. And then we'll add 2 extra points here on the sides. We'll select both of them and then bring them up. And you may be wondering why I'm leaving the apple like a full apple instead of a bitten apple. Well, that's because, as you saw in the original animation, what I did was to have the full apple come in at the start, and then it's as if it gets bitten and then it shatters off into the side from this part here. But we'll get to that a bit later. Now let's move on and recreate the leaf shape as well. And we'll do that into a different layer. So we'll make sure we don't have anything selected. We'll select the ellipse tool, and then we'll just click and drag around here. Go down, convert this to Bezier path, delete the stroke, and then double click on this, and we'll just rotate it like so. Make sure you get these 2 points to line up here, so the one at the top and the one at the bottom. We'll hit T to bring down the opacity, and then we'll select these 2 points, we'll delete those, and then we'll hit G and then hit Control so we can adjust these independently like so. And there you go, we pretty much have the leaf shape at the top as well. So we can rename this to leaf and apple body. And if we turn these back to 100% and shut off the apple at the bottom, there you go, we have successfully recreated the apple shape. And of course, this is all vector based, so if we hit S to bring up the scale and just scale this up like crazy, we're gonna maintain sharp edges. Control Z to undo that. And now we can move on to turning this into a 3D object by using, you guessed it, or maybe you didn't, I don't know, the shatter effect. So let's select the apple body, Control Space to bring up the effects console again, and just type in shatter. Now right away you're gonna see this weird looking UI because the view is set to wireframe and forces, so we can switch that to rendered, and it still looks like nothing is happening until we move the playhead in the timeline. So you can see if we move forward in time, it is indeed shattering. Now in this case, this is not what we're looking for, so let's go ahead and play around with the settings and see what does what. So we'll go over to the shape first of all, and under pattern, what we want to do is switch this to custom. And you can see that makes it disappear, and that's because we're not using any map for the custom shatter. So what we want to do is switch the custom shatter map to the apple body, so that is this layer. And now it is using the source from this layer. Then before we look into any of these other options, let's go down to the force and make sure that all of these values are set to 0. So 0 depth, 0 radius, and 0 strength. And this way we won't have any shattering effect going on. Basically, the force 1 controls the initial impact of the shatter effect. Now we can go back to the shape tab and we can just set the repetition to whatever we want, since in this case we're not going to have a shatter effect going on, so the repetition value is not going to do anything, except we want to take a look at the extrusion depth and just increase that to say 1. And we can see what this does if we head on over to the camera system. So right now it's using its own camera position, and that means it's got its own XYZ rotation and position. What we could do instead is maybe switch to the comp camera, and right now it just disappears because we have no cameras in our scene. But we could go over to layer, new camera, hit OK, and now it's back, and we can just hit C and just orbit around, and you can see that indeed we do have a 3D shape. Now it is a bit weird on the sides here, and the way we can fix that is let's just go back to the apple body, and under the textures here, you can see that the front mode, side mode, and the back mode are all using the layer as a texture. But instead, what we want to do is switch to the color for all 3 of these. And the color mode is going to use this color value up here, and therefore it's going to end up fixing our problem. Now you can see if we switch the color to any type of color that we want, that automatically updates it. And there's also different kinds of modes here. So we got color plus opacity. So in this case, it's going to use the opacity value as well for the front side. So if we lower that down, you can see that we can actually look through the front side as if it was like a glass material, for example. But we'll switch this back to color. and we'll just reset the opacity to 1, and we'll bring back the color to be completely white. Now if we go back to the extrusion depth, we can actually play around with the extrusion here. It's pretty much the same thing as with the Cinema 4D renderer, where we would go down to the geometry options and just increase the extrusion depth. But anyway, we'll leave that at 1, and we'll go back down to the textures. And just so you know, if we go back to the layer mode, let's say we have a solid with a texture, whatever, we'll do like fractal noise, and we'll pre-compose this. So Control-Shift-C to pre-compose, or you can go over to layer, pre-compose, move all attributes, and we'll just rename this to texture. We'll shut that one off and go back to the apple body. You can see here it says front layer. Well, we can choose that texture, and you can see that this allows us to actually mix in textures as well to allow for some pretty cool results. We could even set the side mode to layer and select the texture as well. But do keep in mind that the side tends to sort of give you a stretched result. So there are definitely some limitations when it comes to using the shadow effect. But in our case, we're gonna switch back to colored mode and not have to worry about the textures at all. And we'll just delete this comp. Now moving down, we'll also take a look at the lighting and the material tabs. So we'll go under lighting. Under light type, we can see that there are actually 3 different types of lights that we can use. Right now we're using the distance source. And then down here we got the light color. So obviously you can see what that does. And then we can move it around, X, Y position, increase or decrease the light depth. And then over here at the bottom, you got ambient light. Right now we have some shadow on the sides because the ambient light is set to 0.25, but if we were to set this to 1, everything would be pure white. But anyway, let's just Control-Z to undo everything and set it back to its original state. And then we could switch to the point source, but I don't really see a huge difference between the two. But with the first comp light, you can actually set it to that, and this will become completely dark just because we don't really have a light on our scene. So if we right click, go to light, make a point light and hit OK, you can see now we can use our light in the scene. And this makes it a lot easier to just know where everything is in the scene. So we'll actually use a point light from now on. And then we'll go back to the apple body. And over here at the bottom, you got some extra controls for like the diffuse reflection. You got specular reflection, so you can like increase the intensity of your specular. Oh, and now that we're zoomed in, you can see there's this sort of weird thing that gets created. Like you got these sort of edges on the sides. It's as if there's not enough polygons and it's not really smoothed out. So you do have to keep that in mind whenever you're using the shadow effect to do 3D extrusions of shapes. But anyway, we have covered pretty much most of the things here. So we'll now move on to the next steps. First off, let's select the camera, hit P, and we'll just right click, reset the position. So we're back to where we started. Then we'll select the apple body and we'll go down to the camera system. And in the original logo, what I did was to animate the apple body and the leaf at the top here to come in at separate timings. So that means we're not going to use a camera from our comp. Instead, we're going to use the camera position from the shadow effect itself. And this way, if we copy the shadow effect, Control-C, and then select the leaf, Control-V to paste it, then let's go over to shape and make sure we change the custom shadow map to the leaf itself. So now it's using its own shape to extrude. And since we set the camera system to the camera position, we can control the shape position and rotation independent of the apple body position and rotation. So Control-Z, undo everything, go back to the original state. And now we can start to do some keyframing. So select the camera, delete it, select the apple body, and we'll go down to the camera position and rotation. Let's just set a keyframe for all of these. So all you can do is just click on one of the stopwatches and hold down your mouse and just scroll down here. And then we'll hit U to bring up the keyframes. We'll go over to say 1 second, and then we'll set a keyframe there. We could maybe just push this in the Z space. So we'll go, I don't know, maybe 3 in the Z position. And then we'll go back to the beginning. We'll maybe drag this close to the camera, rotate it. It can sort of cover the entire screen like that. And so it just comes in like so. I'm just playing around with the values, and you can do the same, see what works for you. And what we'll do is actually copy all of these keyframes and just select the leaf body and just paste them. And this will basically copy the entire animation. We can then hit U on this one as well, and then just select all of those and hit F9. And what I want to do is actually have the rotation of the apple body come in a bit earlier. So body comes into place a bit earlier, and then the leaf takes a bit longer to orient properly. And we do have to put this underneath the apple body so it renders behind it. You could maybe select all of these in 75% though, so it rotates a bit faster. And pretty much at 1 second, we want to have all of them be at their final position so that we can have the shatter impact right at this point. Now, before we move on with the shattering effect, I do want to add a couple more things. So first off, let's select the leaf body, and under the camera position, you can see it says focal length. So I want to set a keyframe there, hit U, this will bring up all of the keyframes, and we'll go back here, set this all the way at the beginning, and we'll head on over to say 4 seconds and just decrease the focal length a bit more. So we'll say like, I don't know, 45, and we'll F9 that and set it to 75%. And we'll copy those values and we'll paste them into the apple body. But do keep in mind that wherever your playhead is in the timeline, when you paste it, we can hit U just to see where it is. It's actually going to paste the first keyframe on that playhead. So we're going to have to drag this back just so that we have the constant zoom on both of those objects. And now if we give that a preview, you can see they come in their final position, but they just keep on zooming out a bit longer. Now, I do maybe want to have these just 75%, all of those, just so that they come in to a stop in a more smoother way. And I do want to play around with the lighting a bit more, so maybe we'll go back to the lighting and we'll increase the ambient light to 0.5. We'll do the same for the apple body. And we'll also select the point light, double hit A, so AA, to bring up the light options. And we'll set the intensity to 100%. And I don't know, we'll maybe bring it in a bit more to the front so that it has sort of like a gradient from this point. I wanted to have more of a backlight, so I think that looks fine. Maybe we could bring down the intensity a bit. But I do think that just because we played around with the diffuse reflections here, the material, that's why it's a bit intense on the side. So we can right click on those and just reset them to default. Now it won't be as intense, so we'll do the same for the leaf here. Anyway, as of right now, I'm pretty happy with the way this is moving. So we'll just drop those down. And what we'll do next is gonna blow your mind. Get it? As in shatter, blow. Anyway, we'll head on over to 1 second and we'll select the apple body and hit Ctrl-Shift-D. This will split the layer right at that point. Then we'll go into the shape and we're gonna actually adjust this. So let's just shut off both of these layers and we can bring back the original logo, and just so we can use that as reference. And we can even, I don't know, maybe shut this off so it doesn't distract us. And what we want to do is actually adjust the mask so that it has this sort of hole right here where it got bitten. So we'll select this, hit G to bring up the pen tool, and we'll add 2 points. So we'll add one here and we'll add one here, and we'll click G, bring up the pen tool, hold down Control, and just bend this. And we can actually delete this point and we'll just adjust the shape like so. And we'll rename these to apple bitten, and then we'll duplicate this, Control D, and then we'll rename this to bite. And now we'll create the shape that's supposed to be inside of here. So we'll hit G, we'll create a new mask, just click and drag like so. And then we'll just adjust it. Doesn't have to be perfect because this is gonna shatter, but we do wanna make sure that we have the shape to be approximately the same size. And so that looks fine. We can go down to the contents and then just delete the ellipse and go down into the shape that we just created and delete the stroke. Now we can turn this back on, and of course we want to make sure we go to the shape and switch to the bite shape. And then we can turn off the original logo, turn the apple bitten shape back on as well, and just make sure that we are using the pattern of the actual apple bitten shape. And there you go. Now we can already tell that these are two separate parts. Okay, so now we can start shattering our piece. So first of all, let's go over to the pattern and make sure we switch to a glass mode. And right away, you can notice that the shape goes back to sort of like a rectangle shape. And to fix that, we go over to the texture. Under front mode, we want to switch all of these modes back to the layer mode. And that should basically use the layer that we currently have. But now you can see it's all the way down here. So what we're going to do is just start playing around with the physics and the repetitions and all of that. So first off, let's go over to the physics. And now from this point on, it pretty much comes down to personal taste. But in the original one, what I did was to just have the gravity direction be at 90 degrees. So it just pulls over to the right side. Then we can maybe decrease the gravity a bit, increase the mass variance. And you can notice there's not many pieces right now, and that's because the repetitions is set to 1. So if we increase this, we're gonna have a lot more pieces. But of course, now this sort of breaks the effect. And that's because under the Force tab, we have everything set to 0. So let's go ahead and just right click and reset these to their default value. And right away, you can see they go off into the distance. Now, what I want to do is actually, let's just drag this byte over here to the side and maybe say go back by 10 frames before the actual impact, and we'll set a keyframe on all of these values, and then go back by 1 frame and we'll set them down to 0. And this way, the impact doesn't really happen until we hit the keyframes right here, which have all of the depth, radius, and strength values. So it actually starts to shatter from that point on. And as it is, it's not really too much of an intense impact. So let's go over to the physics and play around with these settings. So let's see, we'll increase the randomness a bit, and we'll also increase the viscosity. Could maybe push the mass variance as well. And then maybe we can even increase the gravity as well so that it pulls harder. You can actually select the keyframes and have the impact happen a bit earlier. Now I'm thinking we need a few more repetitions here, so we'll increase this so we have more pieces, and then we'll increase the viscosity as well. And I'm actually thinking of just increasing the gravity a lot more, just because this is the value that actually makes the most amount of impact. So we'll set that to 10, and then we could even just select these points and have them happen slightly a bit earlier. So if you go back here, you can maybe just push these a bit like so. At the point of impact, it's already like split from the apple body itself. This just makes it feel that much more impactful. And maybe even just increase the repetitions a bit more. And just now I'm actually noticing that this is red. So let's go over to the contents because it is using the layer itself. Let's make sure this is white, and then hit OK. Then we'll go back, and there's this value here that says gravity inclination. And if we increase that, it sort of drags the pieces a bit. So they start off slow and then they go off fast. They're kind of grouped up and moving slowly, and then all of a sudden they just gain speed. Let's just make sure we trim this back to where it actually starts. There you go, that's looking actually pretty cool. Now what we can do to add even more detail is to maybe duplicate this, and we'll rename the one at the bottom to byte big and the one at the top byte small. And if we go over to the shape, now let's make sure we switch to the byte small custom shader map. And what I want to do for this one is actually increase the repetitions to maybe 100 so that this one actually has a lot more pieces, and then we can go down to the physics and maybe increase the gravity because these are smaller pieces, therefore they're going to be pulled a bit faster to the side. We can maybe decrease the mass variance and increase the viscosity a bit, maybe even decrease it. Just depends on what you're going for, but with the way physics work, the smaller the piece, the easier it is to move it around. So I'm guessing these are going to be pulled much faster. So we'll even decrease the gravity inclination here. And now if we bring back the byte big, we'll see that these are moving at 2 different speeds. Now, I don't really want them to split that much, so we'll go back to the byte small, and maybe we'll bring the gravity inclination back to where it was, and even the gravity just a little bit, and then I don't know, maybe increase the randomness. And so if we preview this, we have some bigger pieces, and then we also have some smaller pieces. Now, as for the bigger ones, we can actually go back and just decrease the repetition so there are fewer pieces, maybe even just drag it down even more and increase the gravity inclination even more. So you can see what happens. Basically, they just go off at different speeds. And that's actually looking pretty cool. Now we can move over to say 2.5 seconds, and we'll select both of those and hit Alt, close square bracket. And then once we move forward by 1 more frame, you can see that we're only left with the bitten apple. Now let's go back to the leaf and make sure we turn that back on, and also the apple body at the beginning. And we can quickly preview where we're at the moment. So let's hit N here and hit 0. Okay, so there you go. We pretty much have the final animation, and I'm thinking we could even just put the bite small pieces behind the bigger chunks. And as you saw, it pretty much came down to trial and error, so I highly encourage that you play around with these settings. But yeah, the shadow effect is definitely a very powerful effect, which is built right in After Effects. Anyway, with all of the simulation part out of the way, we can now focus more on the look of this. So first of all, I want to actually adjust the point light so that it comes in a bit more at the front, because this is looking a bit way too gray. We could even go back to quarter view and just try to adjust this like so. And we could even animate it at the beginning. So we'll hit P to bring up the position, and we'll go over to 1 second, set the keyframe there, and we'll go back and we'll just push this back so that at the start, the logo has a backlight. And then as it comes to a stop, it actually fills it in entirely. You can even move it back even more and even animate the ambient light. So we could just go in here and just set a keyframe there, do the same thing for the leaf. Select them both, hit U, match the timing with the actual light there, so 0.1, and you can see how it actually fades in from being a bit dark and then the lights come in. Let's just select all of these and also give them 75% easing so they actually come in a bit faster. Moving on, we'll go back to the project panel and we'll just click and drag on our Apple tutorial comp, and we'll bring it right over to a new comp. We're gonna give it our final touches. First of all, let's Control Y to create a new solid. That's the shortcut for creating new solids. And we'll set the background to be completely black. Hit OK, rename this to black, and then bring it at the bottom. And we'll head on over to the first second. And then what we'll do is Control-Shift-D on the background, and then hit Control-Shift-Y to bring up the solid settings. And we'll switch this back to a white background. Hit New. Then we'll select the Apple tutorial and Control-Shift-D that as well, and we'll Control Space and just type in invert. So this will invert the colors. Now we're left with a black apple on a white background, but I'm actually thinking that I use the other way around. So let's just new adjustment layer, and we'll do invert on the adjustment layer itself. So right here in the beginning, it starts off as black on white, and then it goes off to white on black. We'll just rename this to invert. And then we can go over to the frame where we have the pieces just disappear. I think that was at 230. So we can Control-Shift-D on the invert and just delete that. So it goes back to being black apple on white background. The other thing we're gonna do is select all of those and Control-Shift-C to pre-compose them one more time. And we'll rename this to Apple Extra Effects. Then before we do anything else, let's just set the work area here to like 5 seconds. Hit N, and we'll Control-M to add to the render queue, or you could simply just select this, go over to composition, add to render queue, and we'll just render this out so that when we duplicate it and add all of the other extra effects that we're gonna add, it doesn't really slow down the process. So let's go over to the output module and set the format to be QuickTime, hit OK, and then hit render. Okay, so after you've exported your clip, what we're gonna do next is select the comp itself and the clip, and then hold down Alt and just click and drag and drop into the composition. And this will allow you to swap clips. And this way, now we're using the rendered clip, which goes way faster. Now onto the extra effects that we're gonna add. Let's select the clip, hit Control Space, and type in Shift Channels. And we're gonna give it sort of an RGB split effect. So let's take the red from red. We'll set the green to full off and the blue to full off. We'll duplicate this 2 more times. We'll set this one in the middle to green, and we'll turn off the red. And the one at the top, we'll set the blue to blue, and we'll set the red to full off. Now, if we select all 3 of these, we can just set the mode to be screen, for example. And if we go back to full quality, just so you can see this better, if we move forward in time here, if we just say push one of these to the side, we can now get this sort of very cool looking RGB split effect. Now, of course, we don't want to overdo this, so Control Z to bring everything back to the same spot. And let's just quickly rename this. So we'll do red, green, blue. Push the red a bit to the left on the top side, and then the blue a bit to the right on the bottom side. Next up, what we could do is even add a bit of a blur. So we'll do Control Space, Fast Box Blur, and we'll do iterations 1, and maybe just increase this just slightly so it has some sort of glow to it as well. So we'll do like 2, and we'll copy that and we'll paste that to the red as well. And we could even duplicate this one more time and switch the dimension to vertical. And then if we increase this gives it vertical blur. So I don't know, we'll set this to 1 and we'll set this one to 2. We'll do the same here. Vertical blur radius 2. That's just sort of an extra detail. We'll leave the green as is. And then another thing I did is if we push over here to say 2 seconds, if we go over to the blue layer, hit Control Space one more time and type in optics compensation and just start increasing this, but also just reverse it. You can see it sort of distorts it on the edges. Whereas on the middle here, it just pretty much stays the same unless you just start pushing this like crazy. But what we want to do is just push it slightly to like maybe 10. And then we'll copy that and paste it on the red as well. So both of those are being stretched. Maybe even set the red to 5 just to give it even more variation. Just keep in mind not to touch at least one of them, because if we say copy all of these effects and paste them to the green as well, now all of them have the blur effects and the stretching effects. So the logo is going to end up looking a bit blurry. Let's Control Z to undo. Now, apart from the visual style, I also added some shake to the actual impact point. So we'll go over to 1 second and we'll start animating the position of these. So we'll hit P to bring up the position, set a keyframe, and we'll just manually do this. So we'll go over by say 3 or 4 frames and we'll start moving these around. So we'll go a bit to the right and then finally move over by a few more frames and just hit Control Home to bring them all back to the center. We can also select all of those, hit F9, and just make sure we have these last ones to say 75%. Now that's a bit too slow, so we can just select all of them, hold down Alt and select the last keyframe, and you can just click and drag, and this will allow you to stretch all of the keyframes. We'll bring them in and we'll also bring in these last keyframes. Let's check that out now. Okay, that's much more intense. Now we could even go in here and say at this keyframe, push the blue in some sort of opposite direction. And this makes the split a lot more noticeable, like so. Let's just keep doing this and push the red and the blue always in the opposite direction. So the blue goes up now and the red goes down. It just adds a bit of character to the overall design. Now let's select all of these, go over to layer, and let's pre-compose these one last time. We'll do Apple Final Touches, hit OK, and we'll select this one and hit Control Space, wiggle, and you can see down here it says wiggle position, which basically adds a preset. So you got a wiggle controller and a transform effect, which has the position value linked to both of these values. And what I'm trying to do is just go to 1 second, set keyframes there for the wiggle speed and the wiggle amount, go back by 1 frame, set them back to 0 so we have no shake before the actual impact, and then go over to say 2 seconds or maybe 2 and 10 and just bring them down to 0 as well. So we have this sort of huge impact right here when the shattering happens, but it also continues to sort of float around the scene a bit. So it comes to a stop in a very smooth sort of way. We can maybe drag these over and double click on the 75 preset there, so we have a very smooth sort of animation. And I'm thinking we go over to this frame and we'll do the wiggle speeds to 2, but just decrease the wiggle amount so it doesn't move around as much. And maybe even just bring back the wiggle speed to 1 and set the wiggle amount to 35. You could maybe even drag this over. Now the last thing I want to do is just go back to the comp with all of these red, green, blue channels and just turn on the motion blur, and also go back to the final touches comp, and then we'll right click, add a new adjustment layer and type in Real Smart Motion Blur. Now keep in mind that this is a third-party paid plugin, but what it does is that it adds this sort of fake motion blur to our scene because the shadow effect doesn't really support motion blur. So this is a good workaround. Now if you don't have the Real Smart Motion Blur effect, what you could do is maybe, let's just duplicate this, delete the Real Smart Motion Blur effect on that, and add the CC Force Motion Blur that comes with After Effects. And then you can maybe increase the shutter angle and the motion blur samples. And you can see here with, without, with, without. Now, over at this point, since there's not much movement on these pieces, you're not gonna have too much motion blur going on, so maybe you could increase the shutter angle, but then you get these sort of ghosting effects, and maybe you could increase the motion blur samples, but that doesn't really do much. So I definitely recommend the Real Smart Motion Blur. That just makes it look a lot more cooler. But anyway, let's just give it one last preview. Okay, so there you go. We're pretty much done with the Apple logo animation as well. Now, please keep in mind that the purpose of these logo animations tutorials isn't to specifically teach you how to create the PlayStation logo animation, for example. Instead, we're trying to show you different kinds of techniques that you can use to mix and match with each other so that you can use those techniques to incorporate them within your own ideas and into your own concepts. With all that said, let's now move on to the outro of this video. Alright guys, thanks for watching and being patient all the way through. Consider subscribing and hitting that bell button to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you're interested in following my work or want to ask me any questions personally, then here are all of my social links. If you have any questions or suggestions, then feel free to leave a comment down below. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.